Well, hello there, and welcome back to yet another FileMaker tutorial where we are learning more about FileMaker Pro. My name is Matt Petrowski, bringing you these tutorials over at FileMakerMagazine.com. In this tutorial video, we are taking a look at the topic of dynamic content. We're actually loading content dynamically, and we're using web-hosted content for flexibility. Now, the primary motivation for showing this is that I've built this into my Theme Studio product in terms of the way that help is actually shown. But this doesn't necessarily have to be just help-related content. This can be content that could actually be anything, all the way down to navigation, which drives your solution. Let's take a look at the file, see what I'm talking about. All right, so having switched into FileMaker, taking a look at my example file here, we can see that what I have on screen is over here on the side, I have very clearly a sidebar area with a number of items. Now, normally these items may be fixed values if you put them directly on the layout. In this case, this is a portal, this whole sidebar area. They may come from a separate table within your solution. Let's say you have a table named menu and you're going to load a number of items. That's all well and good when you're working on a FileMaker solution when everybody's on the same network or everybody's always connecting to the same database. No problem. You're typically going to do that all within FileMaker. But what happens when you have a disconnected client? Now, a disconnected client can either be you distributing a single FileMaker file, which people open locally on their machine. And the reason you would do that is because it can load and calculate and do a lot of things on the client much faster and take some of the load off of the server. You may have people that go out into the field that are disconnected and they've got a FileMaker Go solution that's loaded. Or you're distributing something like I am, the Theme Studio, where people just download a copy and you've created a tool within FileMaker. There's lots of different reasons for this. Now, all of this content can pretty much come from anywhere. It can come from within the database, or it can come from outside of the database. Now, in this case, this center portion right here, I'll go into layout mode. You can see right here, the center portion, as indicated by this big globe right here, is clearly a web viewer. If I double click on this, you can see that it's a very simple web viewer. I've got all of the attributes turned on. I'm allowing interaction, displaying the progress bar, displaying status message, automatically encoding. All of those are turned on, but I'm really only referencing one piece of information, and that is a single global variable called WebView.information. So it's important that you note I'm not using an actual URL. I'm not actually supplying content that is a valid HTML that will actually render. I'm simply using a global variable. Now, this allows us to do a lot of really cool things within this web viewer. We can basically show whatever we want. We can show content that's loaded from within the FileMaker file, from a field, or from a block of text, or from pretty much anywhere, or we can use a URL. So it basically dual purposes this web viewer so that I can now use it either for pointing to a URL out on the internet or referencing information internally within FileMaker, which is dynamic. Now, this dynamic aspect comes in the form of we are pulling all of the items in this portal from the web. It's really pretty cool. So in other words, in order to actually update this information, all I need to do is make some changes to a file, save that file, and then it's automatically changed in kind here in the FileMaker solution. What I mean by that is currently you can see that the order is welcome, FileMaker Magazine, YouTube, help video, recent releases, submit bug, etc. The order of these is directly controlled by the order in which they appear within the text file. Doesn't make sense? Well, let's take a look at the text file. Going to switch over to a text editor, Sublime Text, and we're going to look at this file right here, which I have aptly named. Actually, don't want to do that. I want to do that and that. Help-English. Now, I named this file help-english.txt on purpose. Of course, on purpose, but the English part means that this file can be renamed to whatever else I want to support any other language within FileMaker. So, for example, in the Theme Studio, I have a Japanese version and I have an English version. It can be localized. All of this information applies only to the English version. Now, when we look at how I'm actually pulling this URL, I'm pulling it based on the prefix of help and then dash But then this last part within my FileMaker solution is coming from one of FileMaker's get function, which is FileMaker's get application language. So this is a dynamic reference to an actual file based on the version of FileMaker that's being used, allowing me to support the translations or the localization of the actual solution. Now, what we're looking at here in terms of this file, as I zoom out and unwrap, is we are looking at a file that is purely a simple text file. You can see that because it's a .txt file. Each one of these lines is simply a line that directly corresponds to my help. So let's look at this. We've got welcome, and then over here, welcome is our first value. We've got FileMaker Magazine. That is our next value. YouTube. So if I wanted the YouTube help video to actually show up at the end, all I would need to do is triple click to select that, cut it, and then come down and put it at the bottom. This is one of the advantages of the virtual list technology, or the virtual list technique, which basically takes and uses a pseudo portal. Now, I've got so many things going on in here, and I'm throwing a bunch of terms at you, but essentially this portal over here is rendering this content not from values within a field within a portal, but it is rendering these values from their presence within a global variable. Now, this seems a little bit confusing, but let's switch over here and take a look at what I'm talking about. I'm going to bring up the data viewer so that we can see. And I'm giving you the fundamentals here of how this is working, which we will look at when we go into the scripting part. Because if you're not familiar with FileMaker, the scripting part is going to be a little bit difficult. So here we have two different global variables that I want you to pay attention to. I have this global variable called help, and then I have this global variable called portal. Now, portal is the global variable that's being used in order to show the content that is in this portal right here. That means that portal can dynamically change to be nothing. In fact, if I double click this and edit this and delete it, which I suggest you do as well in your copy of the file, if I delete portal and I now go back to my layout and go into layout mode and go back into browse mode, look at what happens. All of my values completely disappear. This portal value is being set from this value help right here. Now, what this means is it allows me to use this general global variable of portal, and because in this solution, I would presume that a user is never on any more than one actual layout for the database. You always determine whether you support multiple windows or not. If you're going to support multiple windows, you would likely need to create a global variable for each of the count of the possible windows that you have. But if you're only ever showing one window, it doesn't matter if I change the value that's in the portal global variable on this layout to something else when I go to another layout, because the user is no longer looking at this particular layout. So each portal that is going to be populated, or each representation of a portal on a given layout, simply needs some type of variable where things are stored. In this case, I'm calling this one help. So think about this. I might have one called navigation. I might have one called something else. And all I do is I take the contents of what's in help and push that into portal. Then wherever the portal is on the layout, the portal will display it. So look right here. I'll just copy this and I will push into this value right here. And we'll go back into layout mode and we'll go back into browse and they show up right there. Now watch what happens when I go into help and I make the change that I was actually telling you about within the text file. Now where the text file comes from right now doesn't really matter. What matters is that you understand that I wanted this YouTube help video to be at the bottom of the list. So I'm going to cut this, go to the bottom, and then copy this. Copy the whole thing. Because remember, portal is what displays it. So I'm going to paste this in. I'm basically doing manually the process of what the scripts actually do. The scripts go out, they grab all of this content from the web, which is in a pre-structured format. It pushes it into the help global variable. then it determines whether or not a user has a search value. Now, the search isn't built into the technique that I have right now, but basically you can search and limit what is shown within the portal, basically limiting the values within here. I may build it in by the time I release the video, but currently it's not in right now. Now, the help simply is being pushed over into the portal, and watch what happens when I go into layout mode and go back into browse. Where did the YouTube video go? Well, it got moved to the bottom, exactly where I wanted it. So the values within the global variable, according to how virtual list works, directly corresponds to the order in which they are shown. That's advantage number one. Advantage number two is going to be the fact that I can do all kinds of things with my own pre-structured format. That's what we're going to talk about next, is how all of this is structured and how it's actually useful to us. Let's take a look at that. All right, so let's talk about what makes this dynamic. What makes this dynamic is that in my use, in the Theme Studio, every time that the user clicks the button, which is basically a button up in the upper right-hand corner, it's got a little help icon, sort of like this little bug. Imagine this is a question mark right here. Every time that the user clicks on that, what I do is I determine whether or not they've got an internet connection, and if they do have an internet connection, then I simply go out to the web and request a piece of information. Now, when you're working with FileMaker Pro, a lot of things get passed back and forth between FileMaker Pro. I've mentioned this in previous videos. FileMaker is constantly trying to figure out, is what I'm showing the user, does it match what's actually on FileMaker server? And if not, then let's do a lot of talk back and forth between FileMaker client and the connected version of the database. Independent of whether or not you've got if you're using a client file that's only local to the machine, but you're still asking for data only from a hosted version of a file, there's still a lot going back and forth. FileMaker's constantly having to determine whether you have or what you're viewing is the current display of data. So it's not like a go get this and then bring it back, and then once you've done that, you're done. FileMaker is a constantly chattering application. So in this regard, whenever you're dealing with information that you really don't care whether it's always dynamic or whether it's always constantly being updated or pulled to know whether it's fresh, it's much easier to pull things from the web. And it's actually a lot faster because you're not having to make a connection to FileMaker server, then negotiate what needs to be displayed, then negotiate the caching that actually needs to happen. No, none of that. This is just purely go out to the web, get this information, and then load it in. And if you use things like hashes, you can actually determine whether or not you actually need to retrieve the full amount of something. But that's a topic for another video. Here, I'm using FileMaker's insert from URL in order to get this. So behind the scenes, which is this button right here, we'll take a look at that. Look at what actually exists right here. And I'm going to delete all of this information, and we're going to see where this is actually going out and getting this. I'm going to bring up the debugger. Well, there's the data viewer right there, which we'll need in order to watch our values. And then I'll bring up the debugger, which I'll make much smaller so we can take a look at as we watch this. Now, this update help button, this button right here, is actually linked to the script called load help within this technique. And load help can happen at any time. In this case, it happens on startup when the technique or when the file is loaded. It also happens every time that the user comes into help. Because if you think about it, each time that a user accesses help, you now have the opportunity, if somebody asks a question, to simply update that help, and then instantly that help has been updated. So here we can see that I'm actually running the script named load help. And as we step through this, we can see what's going on. I'll make the debugger a little bit larger so we can see. Now, the first thing that I'm doing is I'm setting that global variable of help to have a default value. In other words, if a user has a FileMaker solution and it's not even connected to the internet, none of the rest of this will work. It just won't work. It will be worthless. So I need to give them, at a bare minimum, something that tells them what's going on within the help section. So here you can see that I'm setting help to have one value of no connection, then the pipe character. Now, the pipe character happens to be the way that I'm formatting the data. I am determining my format of the data, just like comma separated determines its format, tab separated determines its format. I'm using pipe separated. This pipe means that the first value is the value that I'm going to display in the sidebar, and then the second value is whatever else I want to do with it. Now I happen to be using the hash functions, which are coming from FileMaker Standard, the way that we pass parameters, but it can be used for much more than parameters, as you're going to see. So the next thing is we step through this and we go into the URL, and the URL right here, you can see what I'm doing is, as I zoom in, I'm defining the URL as base.url. So this was something that was created on startup. In other words, spread throughout all of my scripts, I don't want to input the same URL, copy and pasted, and the full URL. Because what happens if this is spread across 5 or 6 different scripts, 10, 11, 12, 50 different scripts? Do I want to have to go in and change all of those different steps? No, I certainly do not. I want to have one place where I can change it. Well, in a startup script, this one place, the base URL, which is the domain and any other subfolders that I want to point to, automatically gets set. Now, the cool thing about this technique is I am taking advantage of a freely available service. I don't even have to have my own web server if I don't want to. I don't have to manage it. I don't have to deal with the delivery of the content, the security of the servers, all kinds of stuff. But I do have to know that if it ever went away, I would have to move it to somewhere else, so I'm always going to have a copy. The service I'm using is GitHub. So if you don't know Git, then you may not be able to use this technique directly, but there are other places where you can get free web services for hosting content. You may not be able to host .txt files, which is critical in this technique, but services like Tumblr. You can set up a Tumblr blog that's free and load all of your help pages right into a FileMaker web viewer. Now here's where we get our help dash, and then look at this. We've got get application language lower.txt. Now what we're going to see is that what's really nice about loading a text file from the internet is that we can use it for all kinds of things. Initially, we're using it for displaying lines, individual lines, which are going to correspond to rows within a portal, which are going to display because I'm pushing them into a global variable. But I can also do things such as version control. This is exactly how I do my version control within the Theme Studio. I simply have an external file out on the web, which is in a format that I can use. In this case, I use a let format. We'll take a look at that and then determine whether or not there's a new version. And it's a really simple script. It's really pretty cool. So now what we're going to do is we're going to simply insert from URL. Now, the one thing I don't like about insert from URL is it requires that the field be on the layout. But you can see right here that I'm inserting my URL value, which was created right here dynamically. In fact, let's take a look at what that URL is. Over here, it will have been created, the URL. And this is important for this particular technique, especially if you want to emulate what I've got here. I am actually pointing to the free service of GitHub, but GitHub has a domain called githubusercontent.com, and it has raw values. Now, I'm actually hosting a FileMaker file. I'm hosting a version control file. I'm hosting the help file, all of it within my repository. FileMaker standards is the username. WebVars is the repository. Master is the branch, and then there is the actual name of the file that's actually created, help-english.txt. So just before we move on, let's switch over to Safari and take a look at this. So here we have this website, which is github.com/FileMakerStandards/WebVars. This just happens to be where I decided to store the content. Obviously, the content can be stored anywhere that you want. It can be stored on your own web server. It can be stored on a public service like Tumblr, where you can set up a free blog. It could even come from Facebook if it's a public Facebook page. What's cool about GitHub is GitHub allows you to store, and it will deliver files such as .txt files. So when I select on this .txt file here to look at it, you notice that it's got all of this stuff around it within the web page, all of the prettiness that makes GitHub a really nice service. But that's because we're on github.com. If you notice, the URL over in FileMaker is raw githubusercontent.com. So switching back over, you see this link right here that says raw. When I take a look at this, watch what happens when I click raw. and it goes over to raw.github user content right there. Same URL, everything. I just simply copied it from here, but look at what's actually being returned as a result. Well, it's just the raw text file. That's beautiful. I can load that directly into my FileMaker field using insert from URL, and pretty much anything that is delivered can now be used within my global variable. All thanks to this free service, or of course your own website if you want. So if we go back to our original example, if I had moved YouTube help video down to the bottom and then pushed this up to GitHub or saved it to my server, that is the order that the help will be presented in the very next time that the user comes into my FileMaker file. That's what makes this so cool. I can control the order. I can control what's displayed. I can also control how things are displayed, and I fully control the structure. So now that you get where the data is actually coming from, we can actually close down the data viewer and step through this. Now in this particular technique, because I'm actually going to a different tab, I'm going to need to, you can see right there, it all got loaded right there, just pulled it right from GitHub, or the GitHub raw content. I'm going to go to the object, which is this web viewer right here, because I happen to be loading it on another tab. I can see that if there was no error, which I should have right after the get insert from URL, if there's no error in terms of getting the content from the web, then let's push the value of help, or let's set the value of help. Now this is my global variable of where this content is stored, because I know that the portal global variable that I'm using right here, I'm using that as a variable global variable, something that can contain either help, or it could contain navigation, or it could contain something else. I want to store it into a dedicated global variable. That right there is the help variable. So we do that, and then finally we update the sidebar. So here's where it comes. You can see that I'm pushing into the portal global variable, the one that actually controls the display variables, the contents that I got from help. Now what makes this really cool in terms of using these two global variables is I can filter portal by using a search value and actually searching for specific values and updating the content of this portal without actually messing with the full contents of help. So help is my storage, portal is my display. Next, in order to use virtual list, you need to actually limit what the portal shows. That's where we're setting this field of portal max, which is the maximum record, which is actually used for the relationship for the virtual list. We'll take a quick look at that. The value of whatever is counted within the portal, and we commit the record request. So let's look at that really quickly. In the defined database, virtual list is really pretty simple. I have a table right here. I have a table called portal right here. I have some table occurrences where I'm on my technique file. The portal max field, which we just took a look at, is simply a global number field. That is relating to, through a predicate based on greater than or equals to this serial number. And this portal right here, if you were to look at it, this particular table, the portal table right here, simply has these 4 values and is completely blank, and in this particular technique has 100 records. You can have 1,000, 5,000. There's really little consequence to having as many records as you want. What is displayed is all a matter of how you break the information of the content out. So you can see that I am referencing the portal global variable, and I'm using the pipe character, my pre-structured format, in order to actually define how data is extracted. Here I'm getting value 1, and in this one, I'm actually getting value 2. So what is value 2? Value 2 is something that I want to evaluate. And what do I mean by evaluate? I simply mean use FileMaker's calculation engine in order to get out what I want from what I'm actually storing. So let's take a look at the structure. Let's take a look over at Sublime and see what I actually have within my help file. Well, this is my structure right here. I'm using this hash function, or the function that is a companion to assign, and that basically is going to allow me to control what happens when you click on this. When I click on welcome, what am I going to do? Well, I've got a URL. What is that URL? Well, it's simply welcome.html. Well, welcome.html doesn't point to anything out on the internet. So that means it must be the domain or the URL, the page, relative to the base URL that I had established in the beginning. So as we'll see, the base URL is pointing to GitHub. If we switch over to the actual GitHub site and take a look at that again, back out to the site, go to the web vars, look at that, welcome.html. And welcome.html is actually storing HTML. Now remember, GitHub is simply going to return raw whatever you get back. So if I hit this, this is what I'm going to get back, which is not going to be a representation of HTML. But if I point to an external page, that external page is actually going to render like a web page. Sorry if that was a little bit confusing, but switching back to my GitHub, the next example of that is right here. So looking at this one, again, we can see that this one, my second link, is FileMaker Magazine. It also is a URL, but it's a fully qualified URL pointing to FileMaker Magazine. I also have this YouTube help video. It is pointing to a URL, and it's looking at this YouTube page. Internally, I also have a new option here. I have HTML. So what happens if I pass in raw HTML? Well, I can simply wrap that around content that FileMaker will actually render within the web viewer as HTML. So this one is going to say not ready with an H1, and it's going to say this section is not ready. You can perform scripts. Here is another option, but you need to use a plugin in order to do this one. Script means that I want you to run script with the internal ID of whatever ID I actually give it. Message. I want you to show a message within a dedicated area of the user interface. Hey, this is a message. Here's where it gets really cool. You can combine multiples of these particular options. I have a message that says, have you updated lately, concatenated or combined with also going to the URL of filemaker.com/support/downloads. I can pass in control variables. In other words, I can have my FileMaker solution do different things based on what variables are set. Passing in vars, I can see that I have a variable named foo set to bar, and I'm also displaying a message at the same time. I can show a dialog. If I pass in dialog information, such as a dialog title, a dialog message, and a dialog button, then all of that information will simply get parsed based on the script that's associated to this portal. So watch this. Welcome. It loads all of my information, which is hosted on GitHub. All of this is hosted on GitHub. Wow, this is a cool way to provide FileMaker help. I click on Magazine. It loads an external URL. Here, it loads directly that URL we looked at. I click on a YouTube video. It's going to load the YouTube video and actually start to play it. Well, hello there, my fellow FileMaker friends, fans, and developers. I click on Recent Releases. This is loading my HTML of not ready. I want it to be something else, then I simply change it within that file. I click on Submit Bug. This actually could run a script, which in my theme studio, it does run a script. It runs a script that goes to a separate layout that allows a user to submit a bug. Plus, you can see that I updated content there. Message only. You can see that I have a piece of text up here that says, hey, this is a message, and colors itself green when it's actually populated. Very easy. This is simply a merge global variable that when we look at the conditional formatting, that simply says, if the contents of message is not empty, then go ahead and give it a fill color of green and a text color of black. Now, the one thing you'll see is in the script that each time that you click any one of these sidebar portal clicks, it clears the message. So if I click Submit Bug, you can see that the message goes away because it doesn't really correspond to this particular item. But if I click Message with URL, have you updated lately? And I also take the user to FileMaker's downloads right here. Very cool. Control variables. This one you would need to see, but I set the variable foo with the contents of bar according to that text file. And finally, a dialog. Look, ma, it works. If I change the content within that text file, then of course whatever's pulled into the download folder and then pulled into the actual content, if this dialog value right here, if I had changed this dialog message to look pa, it works, and that was pulled in and then pushed into help and then pushed into portal, when I click dialog, what would happen is it would say, look pa, it works. It's so dynamic, it's really pretty cool. So the last thing that I'm going to wrap this video up with is actually walking through this process. And we're going to see how this actually works by stepping through the script. So I'm going to bring up the debugger and I'm going to click on welcome. And we're going to watch this script as I go through it. The first thing that I do is I set the eval to the value that's coming from the portal table. Now remember, all of this content that's pipe separated here, it's already been loaded into my global variable called portal. The portal that's being displayed right here is actually displaying based on the contents that are within that global variable of portal. But I can still reference the value over in the other table, even though the table that is actually using a calculation. This is a calculation, this eval, which is getting the second value of any one of these strings based on whichever row I click on. So that hopefully that makes sense. So I've captured that into eval. Let's take a look at it. Go to eval. Look at that. The eval portion is URL welcome. So that's our value that was caught. Now we're going to set our portal selection to the actual record ID. This is simply something that's necessary just in order to highlight what is the row that's selected. FileMaker has an internal ID, and we're going to use that for using conditional formatting on each of these rows, which you can take a look at yourself, that says if the value that's within portal selection matches whatever my record ID value is, then I'm the one that is selected. And that's what allows me to show the actual selection, what is currently selected. So now we're going to clear the message. We always want to have that be clear. We're going to refresh the object name, which is the message. We're going to commit our records for the purpose of having a clean, no records are opened at this time. But we're now going to assign and evaluate whatever's in eval. So by doing that, what we did is we created any of the variables that were established as part of pulling this second value off. So if the second value had just the URL, that's all that we got. If it had a URL, a dialog, and a message, which it could very well have, it would do all of those things because this script is going to break all of them down and simply walk looking for each of the variables. So the first one is, did I have a vars request? Nope. Did I have a message request? Nope. Did I have a URL request? Yes, I did. So in this case, I'm doing a little bit of logic that says, if the beginning of the URL does not have HTTP and it does not have HTTPS, then I'm not looking at a fully valid URL. That means that I'm looking at a URL path or part of a URL path. That means I want to start with whatever my base URL is, assuming that I'm always going to the same website for most of the content, unless it's an external content. I'm going to take the base URL, which in this case is the GitHub raw content, and combine that to the URL that I did get, which happens to be just the fragment of welcome.html. So as you'll see, a result of that, the URL just got set right now. If we look at our data viewer, URL actually got set to my base URL, which is everything that I have highlighted right there, plus the portion that actually came in. And that's what allows me to actually have a dedicated site, but also support external links. So I'm going to set the web viewer information, that's my global variable that's used for display within my web viewer. Here I've got some GitHub raw HTML. Now all of these steps right here are simply used because if I'm pulling from GitHub, I'm pulling HTML that will be displayed as text, not rendered as HTML. So I actually have to convert it. And you can see that right here where I'm setting webview.information to a data text URL. This is something that will convert local content so that the web viewer will actually display this as valid HTML. And that's all that these steps are doing. I'm going to insert and download the URL. You can see right here, it got all of the URL content right here, pulled it from GitHub. I now convert that within the web viewer information, and now I'm going to go to the web view. You can see that it's actually being rendered. I set the web viewer to reset or update, which it does right there, and that is my content that's loaded. The rest of what could run is not going to run because those items weren't passed in. There was no script that was set. There was no HTML that was set. There was no dialogue that was set. But remember, you can do all of these actions if you wanted to. So just to show you that you could control the direction of your scripts or what this script actually does by branching out to other scripts, we're going to take a look at the control variables and run through that one quickly. So here you're going to see that I'm going to get a vars, and vars is going to say, I want you to set the result of vars to actually assign the vars. Now I'm going over this one because it can be pretty confusing unless you step through the debugger and look at what you have. Here's what came in. I got two distinct situations that I want to evaluate. I got vars, in which I want to create the variable foo with the content of bar. I also got a message, which I could have gotten a dialogue, which I could have gotten a web page, all of which could actually be referencing a variable of foo. And if you think about this, because we're evaluating, we have full access to FileMaker's calculation engine. We can get access to anything based on the current privilege set. I can reference a field. I can use get layout object attribute and reference something that's on the layout. I can use any of FileMaker's get functions. I can determine whether they're on an iPad or whether they're on a desktop machine. Anything that you can do within FileMaker, you could evaluate at the point in time that you're evaluating this and creating these variables, and then have your script make any type of determination based on that. So what I'm doing here is, as you'll see, when I hit this next step right there, foo got set to bar. So within this script, I could now branch off to any other script if I wanted to. At this point, go out and perform something else based on whatever I got. It really is fully dynamic. That's what makes this so cool. So we set our message right here. The variable foo was created. The rest of my script, URL could actually modify based on foo. Script could modify based on foo. HTML could modify based on foo, and so forth, like dialogue. You can see that this is really pretty cool in terms of a technology. First off, the content comes from the web. It can be dynamically controlled. Second, your script can basically branch and do all kinds of things. You're not limited. You can go in and create completely new structures if you wanted to. If you wanted to create a new structure that said something like show layout, and that layout you're now going to pipe, all you have to do is create a new structure and say layout. And then you could actually give the layout name if you wanted to. Or if you were coding your solution in a way that you were actually using layout IDs, which is how I would do it, you could put in, I want you to go to layout 24. And at the same time, I want you to also show a dialogue of, hey, you made it. Upload this to my website, and as long as my script actually understands this particular value of layout and will go to the layout as a generalized command, it would go to that layout and it would show this dialogue of, hey, you made it. That is what makes dynamic loading content so powerful and flexible, plus fast, because you're loading very small files, typically from the web, and not having a lot of chatter back and forth with FileMaker. All right, so now that we've taken a look at how we can dynamically load content for the purpose of displaying it, let's take a look at how we can actually use this same thing in order to manage the version control of our actual solution. This is exactly how I'm doing this in the Theme Studio, and how I would do this with any remote file where you have a new version and you actually want to find out whether there is a new version. Now, technologies like FM Easy Sync, they actually will sync down new versions for you. That's something you can take a look at as another article on the FileMaker Magazine website. But this is so simple that it's just really pretty cool, and you can do all kinds of different things with this. Now remember, on GitHub, I'm actually hosting raw text files. And those raw text files simply load down into a field based on using insert from URL. Or in my case, I would probably use a plugin because I don't have to actually have the field on the layout. Well, the contents of this can be anything, including the internal portion of a let statement. So let's take a look by clicking this version check button. I'll bring up the debugger and we can see how easy it is to actually open and load a FileMaker file that is remotely hosted on a web server. So I'm going to click version check and we're going to walk through this. It's just these steps, 10 steps, that's it. First off, I'm going to insert from URL, pointing to my base URL, a file called config.txt. Now I point to all kinds of things like version.txt, plugin.txt, whatever it is that I want to get. But as soon as this inserts, I want you to recognize right here what actually came in. What came in is 2 local variables if I was to define them within the context of a let function. Latest version, 3.0. Download link, the link of a file that I want to download. The file happens to be a .fmp12 file, pointed to the file that's hosted on the free service GitHub. I can't emphasize that enough. This is so cool. The next thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to run an if statement that says if is valid expression, evaluate a let function with this portion, all of this content right here passed in as the internal part of the let definition section. So everything that's in technique download, I'm wrapping around that, the let, and I'm simply returning a true value. But what's actually going to be returned from this result is the result of is valid expression. Meaning if it actually evaluates properly, then everything was successful. If it doesn't, then it's simply going to move on because it won't have been evaluated. So that means that this content would not have been validated. I always take my content and put it into the data viewer just in order to make sure it works before I put it up online. But basically, I evaluated it was true. Now here's how I run my versioning within my files. I create a script, and the script name itself is what's returned as the value that I want. If this doesn't make sense, you'll see right here. I go into this. This script is named 3.0. Now there's nothing in FileMaker that prevents me from changing this to 4.0, 5.0, 6.0, etc. The name of the script is independent of how FileMaker actually references and uses it internally. FileMaker has an internal ID for the script so that the name can change and be whatever it wants to be. If I return the name of the script, it actually returns the value of the version of my solution. So that's all I do. The very first script in all of my solutions is the version number, and I can use version checking. So you can see right here that I'm exiting this script with the name of the script that I'm currently in. What's the name of the script I'm currently in? 3.0. So you can see right here, I'm going to set the variable, this version, to get the script result. So let's look at it. What's the script result going to be? Well, I just told you it's going to be 3.0. This version, 3.0. So now all I need to do is do a comparison. If the latest version, the value that I got from the web, is greater than this version, then here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to insert from URL again whatever value I got, which is the download link. What is the download link? Well, it's a pointer to a FileMaker file. Look at that. That's pretty cool. Well, in this case, the version wasn't the same because my version number wasn't set. But watch how easy it is for me to actually set that. I go over and I'll change it to 1.0 and save it. What's going to be returned as a result of clicking the version check? 1.0. Is 1.0 going to be greater than 3.0? Nope. So we're going to go into the debugger again, and we're going to step through this. Return the 1.0. We did that. If the latest version is greater than this version, it certainly is. Let's insert from URL pointing to the download link. And here we go. Look at that, a FileMaker file loaded from GitHub into a container. I'm going to set a variable of the file output path to the desktop path, plus the actual name of the file right here. I could name it whatever I want to. Then I'm going to run an export field contents And one of the settings on this export field contents is to open the target application. So as I close the debugger out, which I'm going to do right now, look at what happened. A FileMaker file got downloaded into a container, exported to my desktop, and then opened to do whatever else I want. This file could install a plugin. That's one of the things that I do. This file could also automatically have relationships to the file that was actually loaded. This file could then close this file and then install a file that came from within a container in this file to replace the file that you closed. It's basically the principle of how you actually can update one FileMaker file to a completely new version. As long as a FileMaker file is closed, a separate file can replace that file, typically as long as it has write permissions to where the file is. And that's fundamentally how you can do version control within, well, 10 steps for actually checking the version, but the rest of the steps are going to be up to you in terms of how you actually replace the file and what you do with it. But the fundamental, the principle is here for you to do whatever you want to do with it. So there you have it. There is dynamic loading content. Loading content from the web and having your FileMaker solution do all kinds of different things based on whatever it loads from the web. The possibilities are pretty much endless. The limits to collaboration have just been opened wide open. You can now collaborate and allow other people to push things up to a website, such as GitHub, and then deal with those things if you want to, or forget them. In other words, GitHub, if you take the time to learn a little bit about using Git, allows other collaborators to make contributions to your solution. In my case, it would be a localization. If you take a look at my help file and it's in English and you want to create a help file within Italian, you could do that. You create the file within Italian within your own GitHub account, and then you make a pull request for me to integrate that into my solution. This is what the rest of open source is all about. Outside of the world of FileMaker, all kinds of collaboration is going on in this way using services such as GitHub. As long as the information that you're hosting on a public service is not something that you want to keep private, no problem. But also keep in mind that FileMaker server itself runs its own web server, and you can get and store information on the FileMaker server itself too. That can either be behind a firewall within a protected local area network, or can be exposed to the wide area network depending on how things are structured. Really, there's no limit in terms of what you can do, and it is really pretty awesome stuff. I hope this video has helped you out, helped you learn more about FileMaker, learned more about technology and using it in general with FileMaker, and as always, much luck and happy FileMaking.